Hi everyone, I'd like to welcome you back to the channel. Last time we talked about God's wrath, and we were looking at some verses that talked about looking at that we're not destined for wrath, but for salvation. And basically, what we've seen there is when it talks about us not being destined for wrath, it means eternal wrath, as it's compared to eternal salvation. So one thing I didn't do when I was looking up that word, I didn't actually do a word search on destined for wrath or appointed for wrath. And when I did that, I found another verse here in Matthew 24:51. It says, and will cut him to pieces and put him with the hypocrites in the place where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now, if you look at the word put him, that's the same as the word destined or appointed for wrath. And so here again, we see that Christ is saying that those who aren't ready, who are wicked servants, are destined or appointed for wrath. And so we see that's an eternal context, not wrath during the tribulation, but in eternity. And so that just gives us an idea what he was talking about there. So it's not appointed for wrath during the tribulation. So again, if we have the proper view, proper position of the tribulation, of the rapture, then all the verses fit into it. So next, we're just going to look at some of the places. So we will be going through the tribulation, and of course there is wrath. God's wrath is in the tribulation. And so we're just going to take a picture of that and how that might work out. So first, we go to Revelation chapter 6, and says, "Calling to the mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who is seated on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of their wrath has come, and who can stand?" So basically, that's just that is showing that God's wrath is poured out in the tribulation. Next, go to chapter 11. It says, "But your wrath came, and the time for the dead to be judged." So again, talking about God's wrath in the tribulation. And then in chapter 16, "And God remembered Babylon the Great, and gave her the cup of the wine of the fury of his wrath." And so again, God's wrath during the tribulation there. And then verse 19, or chapter 19, verse 15, "And he will tread the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God the Almighty." And then if we look at chapter 16 in Revelation, actually the first verse talks about this being the bowls being the last of God's wrath being poured out. So here when we look at verse 2, it says, "Painful sores came upon the people who bore the mark of the beast and worshipped its image." So here God is pouring out his wrath, and there's painful sores. The next one, verse 3, it says, "And it became like blood of a corpse, and every living creature died that was in the sea." And then verse 4, the third bowl, "The rivers and the springs of water, and they became blood." And so here's the plague of blood on the sea and the springs of water and the rivers. And then we'll skip down to verse 10 there. It says, "And its kingdom was plunged into darkness." So another one of the bowls of his wrath was darkness. And then when we look at the seventh bowl, it says, "And great hailstones, about 100 pounds each, fell from heaven on people, and they cursed God for the plague of hail, because of the plague was so severe." So now when we look at these plagues, the bowls that were poured out, probably many of you will think, "Oh, that sounds familiar." And where does it sound familiar from? Well, it's from when the people of Israel were slaves in Egypt, and so you have some of the same plagues happened at that time. So there's a plague of blood, just like we read in Revelation there. And so here in Exodus chapter 7, verse 20, it says, Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord had commanded, in the presence of Pharaoh and his officials. Aaron raised the staff and struck the water of the Nile, and all the water was turned to blood. The fish in the Nile died. So here's the first plague that came on Egypt, and it's the same as we see in Revelation. And then in the sixth plague, Exodus 9 verse 10 says, So they took soot from the furnace and stood before Pharaoh. Moses tossed it into the air, and festering boils broke out on man and beast. And so if we look back to Revelation there, it was talking about sores coming on people. And then go on to the sixth plague. The seventh plague is hail. And so tomorrow I will rain down the worst hail that has ever fallen in Egypt. And so we've seen in the last, in the seventh bowl there, or seventh plague, there was also hail, like 100-pound hail. And so we see that there's a definite correlation here. Some of the same plagues going on in Egypt as going to happen at the end of the world. And so we see that when the people of Israel were in Egypt, God didn't take them out when He poured out this wrath on Egypt. They were in there, and actually, I believe it's the fourth plague and on, God actually protected the people of Israel, and so they didn't get it, all these plagues like the people of Egypt, but yet they were right there in the land. And so this could definitely be a possibility of what happens in the end, that God will supernaturally protect the people during the tribulation, protect believers during the tribulation. So here we go on to the ninth plague, and in verse 22 it says, So Moses stretched out his hand toward heaven, and total darkness covered all the land for 3 days. And it says, Yet all the Israelites had light. And so here there's a separation between the Egyptians and the Israelites, even though they were in the same land. And so I believe God can do that same thing in the future during the tribulation, that He can protect the believers who are going through that time. Now, it doesn't say anything specifically about that in Revelation, but there is, as we see, there is a precedent for that. And Revelation 9 kind of gives a hint of that. He says, They were told not to harm the grass of the earth or any green plant or any tree, but only those people who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. And so here it's saying that plague was just for those who didn't have the seal of God on their forehead. So God can protect His people through, even when He's sending a plague, He can have special protection for His people. We've seen that, like I say, in Egypt, and also when we look in Ezekiel, where God was going to pour out His wrath on the city of Jerusalem, He did the same thing. If we go to Ezekiel 9 verse 3, it says, Now the glory of the God of Israel had gone up from the cherub on which it rested to the threshold of the house, and He called to the man clothed in linen, who had the writing case at his waist. And the Lord said to him, Pass through the city, through Jerusalem, and put a mark on the foreheads of the men who sigh and groan over all the abominations that are committed in it. And to the others He said in my hearing, Pass through the city after him, and strike. Your eyes shall not spare, and you shall show no pity. Kill all men outright, young men and maidens, little children and women, but touch no one on whom is the mark. And begin in my sanctuary. So they began with the elders who were before the house. So we see here that God was supernaturally protecting those who had His seal on their foreheads. So God can certainly do that again. So we have two examples in the Old Testament where God did exactly that. And so during the tribulation, he can certainly do the same thing again. And my guess is that he will. I don't know for sure. That's just a guess. But we see that he can do that, and certainly there's kind of hints that he would, because he's just, on a couple places, he's just saying, do it to those who have the mark of the beast on them. So yeah, so just I guess just maybe a comfort to us that, even though we have to go through the wrath of the tribulation, God can save us through that. Great. Thanks for listening. God bless, and remember to persevere to the end. Thank you.